morgue workers, pathologists, medical examiners, etc. What is the weirdest cause of death you've diagnosed? A med student here in Germany. In our pathology seminar, the professor told us about some weird cases he handled. The weirdest is that some guy had a fetish for cheese. Yes, cheese. He liked to wrap himself in cheese with those plastic wrappers. And when I say wrap himself, I mean all of his body was wrapped in cheese. He got sick and had fever, but he would not unwrap himself. And he could not sweat, and so he could not transmit heat and pass of hyperthermia. The professor had to unwrap the plastic and remove the melted cheese. Humans are weird. Story 2, autopsy technician. I had a guy who bled and passed after he hit himself. Serious mental illness was involved. I ran a funeral home for a few years, and I've been assisting on autopsies for many years, so I could probably think of plenty of crap. Story 3, cousin works for the county coroner in Arizona. Lots of bodies found in the desert, but the worst one she told us about was a guy decapitated by a wood chipper. There was a length of string in with the wood he was loading in there, and somehow it got wrapped around his neck. That was that. Story 4, I can talk about this one actually. I was a morgue intern in college. There weren't really many weird causes of death. 80% of it is just heart disease in its various forms, then just failure of other organs. Then you have the occasional physical accident, the very rare homicide. The weird things were usually the situations that came up. My personal favorite example would have to be this one. Imagine, if you will, a 400-pound woman driving alone on the highway. For reasons unknown, she drives off of the road into a ditch. The car flips upside down, she's hanging by her seatbelt. The EMTs arrive, she's barely conscious, they cut her seatbelt. She comes down, she goes out, she never comes back up. So anyway, the logistics of managing 400 pounds of dead weight are challenging to say the least. It takes 4 of us to get anything done. The doctor is doing the usual external examination and needs to see the backside. 2 people get on one side to pull, and someone else and I get on the other side to push. And as I push against the rolls of fat, I slowly lift it up like a treasure chest in The Legend of Zelda. And what do I find? 4 dimes hidden in the rolls of her back fat. I think the weird thing about this is that she was wearing a shirt when she passed, which means those dimes were already there. Like, did she keep them there on purpose? Would she be driving with someone and say, "Hey Jim, can you get the change for the toll?" Second shelf, far right. And I have to imagine that they had to return the money to her relatives, along with everything else. Here's her clothes, here's her purse, here's 40 cents. Don't ask. Story 5, I was on the verge of working the county morgue last summer. The morgue is right beside the county prison too. So the morgue processes deceased inmates for the county because it's cheaper that way. When I went in for my formal interview, they took me on a little tour and run through of what they do and procedure, and they let me sit in while they did an autopsy. The guy on the table was an inmate in maximum security who passed in his cell, and no one was sure how. So they start to work their way through the process of the autopsy, and they notice lots of blood near his intestines. As they start to inspect that, an intern saw something in the guy's rectum. This dude has shoved a short but thick metal rod up inside, assumably as a sex toy. He, in the process, hit the internal parts inside and he passed. Story 6. Not working in any of the above professions, but I did work as a homicide detective. So there was this man who had this illness where his muscles, bones, or joints fused or something. Can't remember properly. So his body became quite rigid, and eventually he was taken to a hospice where they took excellent care of him, except his bed malfunctioned. Like in a cartoon, both the top and lower half of the bed could not stop moving towards each other. He couldn't get out, call for help, so the bed literally broke him. This was several years ago, and I really do not remember the details. Just that it was the weirdest way of dying I ever saw. Story 7. Never actually seen it, but think walking ghost syndrome is one of the weirdest, coolest causes of death. Basically what happens is, after getting exposed to just the right amount of radiation, a person will get sick for like 3 days, seem to recover, then 3 weeks, they pretty much drop dead out of nowhere. It happens when the radiation is just enough to hit your bone marrow, but not much else. Bone marrow is extra vulnerable to radiation. You get sick due to toxicity from your bone marrow dying, then seem to recover once your immune system cleans up the dead cells. However, you now have no bone marrow. So once your red and white blood cells start dying off, they aren't getting replaced. You lose your immune system, and your blood loses the ability to carry oxygen. Can you imagine thinking you had beat radiation poisoning, only to suddenly pass a few weeks later? Nowadays we know about it and know to check marrow health immediately following radiation exposure. But back in the day, it must have been terrifying. Story 8. I did some maintenance work in a city morgue, so I occasionally saw the autopsies. One skeleton in a septic tank. Not sure how he wound up in there. Second biker dude who ended his life, but he had his hands handcuffed behind his back. Very clever dude. Story 9. I have no medical training, but my neighbor lady did pass in a legit Final Destination style, she was mowing her yard with a push mower and ran over some sort of wire or hay string which shot out of the back of the mower, wrapped around her neck, and she passed. Story 10. Doctor here. A friend of mine was on call on one of our medicine rotations and was called to the ER to do an admission. The patient in question was an elderly man who came to the ER because of progressive leg weakness. A CT scan of his chest and abdomen showed complete occlusion of his aorta somewhere in his mid-abdomen. There was literally no blood flow going to the lower half of his body. Even the radiology report stated, "This condition is not survivable." The man passed less than 2 hours later in the ER. Never even made it up to the floor. Story 11. I work as an anatomist, and one of my colleagues remembers back in the 90s dissecting a male who accumulated about 30 cigarette butts throughout his GI tract. Story 12. Patient was being transported via stretcher on elevator. The transporter pushed the stretcher onto the dark elevator just as the elevator was being called up to another floor. The elevator pulled the patient into the shaft, leaving her hanging upside down. Patient was screaming. Her family witnessed the whole episode. Fire department came and got her out, went to surgery, and passed. There was an Otis repair crew working on the elevator because it was stuck. They didn't put up signs that said it was out of order. Transporter was new employee and didn't question why the lights inside elevator off. OSHA now has mandated that metal bars across the doors and big yellow signs to indicate out of order. Employees who witnessed it resigned from PTSD. I still work at the hospital, and some people will ask, am I on the elevator that lost that lady? It's been almost 20 years since it happened. Story 13. I didn't diagnose this, but for me, the weirdest cause of death is this. 45-year-old João Maria de Souza was hit by a cow falling through the roof of his home in Caratinga, Brazil. The cow having climbed onto the roof from an adjacent hillside. His wife, who was lying in bed next to him, and the cow were both unharmed. The death was labeled as bizarre. Story 14. Not in any medical field, but my mother had told me at one point that she went to elementary school with a girl that had stuck her head out the bus window. Apparently, her long hair had wrapped around a passing sign pole. She passed, traumatized me for years. Story 15. I don't work in the field, but my grandma's old neighbor across her back lane had a pretty unfortunate ending. He was in his kitchen standing over the stove, making himself something when he keeled over and wound up pass. Laying on the running burner. No one knew until a family member went to check up on him a day or two later. I can't imagine the sight or smell of finding a 2-day-old corpse that has been on a running burner the entire time. I also had a distant relative fall into a china cabinet while drunk and pass, if that counts. Story 16. I'm not professionally involved in any of those lines of work, but a few years ago I was at a lecture where a forensic pathologist told us about a presumably psychotic guy who passed by ramming his pet bird down his throat. Story 17. Obligatory, I'm not a morgue worker, but shortly after moving into our new house, my partner and I saw the neighbor in his yard, so we went out to meet him. Eventually, the topic of discussion turned to the house next to him. He told us the woman who owned it was a total hermit, hadn't left the house in 20 years. Her father passed a few years back, and she never had friends or family visit. Apparently, she may have had mental issues, according to him. Anyways, she decides to end her life in her basement, but because she was a shut-in, nobody knew. For months. The only reason it was ever discovered is the mail guy said her mail was piling up, so he decided to peek in her window. The dog was passed by the door, so he knew something wasn't right. The family won't even come clean it up, because it's apparently that gross in the basement. Story 18. I'm not morgue worker and don't work in a related field, but there's a documentary show on Netflix called Unusual Deaths or something like that. Anyway, one was of a girl who went to open a hotel door with a key card, and when she grabbed the hotel room door handle, she was electrocuted and passed. Couldn't let go of it because her hand muscles clench when getting electrocuted. It turns out that room's wall heater was malfunctioning and created a short between it and the metal in the wall door, electrifying the handle. You can die absolutely any time for any reason, and you have no control over it. Enjoy every minute. Story 19. I have a 1. A while back, I was a police officer in a large county in Texas. I was assigned to a special unit that targeted abuse, organized crime. There was a woman, 22 years old, who was the girlfriend of a major dirtbag in our area. She was trying to clean up for her young daughter. Long story short, she was busted by the feds, along with her BF, and her case fell back in our lap. I had previous dealings with her in a UC capacity, and our DA was lenient. This wasn't a snitch situation. She gave us no usable info. She wanted out, kind of forgot about her for a few years, until patrol got a call to her house for a check welfare. Nobody had heard from her for a while. Officers went to the scene with me accompanying, and found a screen door locked from the inside. When we forced entry to check welfare, we found her pass on the kitchen floor. Her kid was next to her, still alive, but they had spread out a bunch of Pringles chips and snacks by her body. She passed of overdose, and her kid, Not knowing what pass was, tried to feed her. Story 20. A fellow paramedic had gotten a call for a welfare check on an older lady. The family hadn't heard anything from her in a few days, maybe about a week. Buddy and Fire make entrance and are hit with a wicked stench. He goes to the master bathroom where he finds her upside down. Water's all pink. She must have slipped and fell getting out of the tub and inadvertently passed. Story 21. Medical examiner showed us some of his photos. One most memorable was a man who stuck a large caliber gun into his mouth to end her life. When the me got there, he saw the man slump back in the chair. Story 22. I work in marketing. I found my 70-something-year-old neighbor pass. It was a hot summer day in Mississippi, and I had came home for lunch around 2 p.m. I went to check my mailbox, which was right next to this lady's apartment. Right when I got out of my car, I noticed a terrible odor. As I got closer to the mailbox, I kept seeing a ton of bugs flying around. They were all crowding around this lady's window screen. Little background of this lady: she had some sort of mental illness and did some very peculiar things. She was a bit of a shut-in and would literally run inside if she ever saw someone outside. So I always assumed she was a hoarder and lived in a nasty apartment. Back to the story, I was grossed out by the bugs, but figured the summer heat in her apartment made the trash smell or something got my mail. Went to my apartment and ate lunch. It kept nagging on me, so on my way back to work, I stopped by again and tried to peek inside the apartment through the open window. The smell was horrific. I couldn't ever see her and didn't know what to do. So I called my buddy who was an EMT in the town, and he told me to call 911. A few days later, I noticed that they were gutting her apartment. So I called my EMT friend to ask what happened. He said they went in and found her dead. She'd passed about a week prior. I always felt bad that she passed so alone, and it took a random neighbor noticing a foul smell to find her body. I know her quality of life was poor, so I'm glad she found some rest, but still a sad situation. So for someone who doesn't work in a medical field, pretty crazy to me. Story 23. The person involved had tied a rope to a lamppost, put the rope through a car window and around the neck, and basically just accelerated into pass. A tragic story for sure. But I couldn't shake the thought that this was such an unusual way to end life. Although the colleague in question is a somewhat unreliable character, so I still wonder if the case is really true. Story 24. My great-uncle used to work on the London Underground in the 60s and 70s, doing track maintenance, etc. He witnessed a passenger become frustrated because his train was late. The passenger went to the very edge of the platform, right at one end, and craned his neck to look into the tunnel to see if he could see the train. He saw the train all right. I can only begin to imagine what the autopsy report said. Story 25. I wasn't a pathologist or medical examiner, but a histology tech that assisted with autopsies periodically years ago. We did a routine autopsy on an elderly woman that died during a hospital stay. Prior to the autopsy, we remove all the leftover tubes and catheters. Once that's done, the pathologist starts dissecting the organs out, doing a gross examination, weighing each one, then saving pieces of tissue he's interested in. During the dissection of the heart, he cut open one of the chambers and was tossing little pieces of tissue he wasn't interested in into the trash. He then tossed a small piece of plastic that looked like the end of a catheter. I asked what it was, and he replied that it was just that, and that it was probably a piece he cut while removing the heart. I then reminded him that we'd removed all the catheters prior to the autopsy. He quietly reached into the trash, pulled the piece out, and submitted it for further gross examination. As it turns out, someone must have sheared off the end of a 22-gauge catheter when giving the lady an IV and never reported it, maybe not realizing what they'd done. That piece traveled to the heart and lodged in a valve and caused her death. Years before as a medic, I always remembered when they taught us to put catheters in, to never try to rethread the needle if we weren't quite in the vein, but to start from scratch with a new catheter. This was a bold reminder. Now as a nurse, I still see nurses not wanting to bother restarting with a new catheter, and I have to stop and tell them the story. Story 26. I have a friend who used to work in a morgue. She told me about one time a lady passed in her house and no one had come to find her for a week or two. When someone finally showed up, they found her little white dog with black all around, its mouth from eating, you know? Story 27. I'm a histotechnician in an anatomical pathology laboratory, and if my daily duties allow it, I assist with autopsy. I don't know if it's really the weirdest thing I've seen, but an autopsy was performed on an individual after he fell over dead on his wife's girlfriend after they were finished having sex. Turned out he had a severe case of hypertension. His heart was easily double the size that it should be and was taking Cialis. His death was ruled as a heart attack. Story 28. An accidental death where a guy and his friend had been drinking and watching some show about people getting liposuction. One of the guys has the great idea of a DIY redneck liposuction. They go to his workshop with even more liquor, and he proceeds to put an incision in his abdomen and try to use a shop vacuum to suck out the fat. He sucked almost all of his intestines out. but not a single ducking ounce of fat was in the vacuum. The friend was freaked out when he sobered up, but told us his buddy was laughing and didn't see anything wrong. Story 29, worked for a volunteer fire ambulance service for a while. We found a guy in his garage, naked, headfirst into a 55-gallon drum of piss and crap. It was like 80 degrees out, and he had been there for about 2 days, so the smell was horrendous. There was a video camera set up, and the police reviewed the tape. Turns out he was into scat, piss, and would store crap and piss in the drum and huff it while he pleasured himself. It was too much for him, and he passed out and fell in headfirst and drowned. Story 30. Does a story from my buddy who works in ambulance count? Body found in the tub. They tried to remove him. He wouldn't lift up. Roll him to see why, and there was a plunger stuck up inside of him. He was pleasuring himself in the tub with it, slipped and impaled himself. He tells the story better, but I think I got the gist of it. Story 31. Sometime in the early 2000s, a man mowing the fields at Morton Arboretum near Chicago was bounced off his tractor and ended up under the tow-behind mower. The kill switch malfunctioned, and he ended up under the mower for several hours. The next day, my YMCA camp took a tour of the morgue where the deceased ended up. I still have no idea why the YMCA took children on a tour of a morgue, but I remember that horrific story. Story 32. Not in me or other, but heard this from a paramedic buddy. I can't verify the truths of this, as it was told to me secondhand. Pass via guitar string. Dude super glues his hands to his head and pass with the guitar string from a steel beam. Pretty gruesome, but points for creativity. Story 33. I'm not in me or anything, but I work in a trauma center and unfortunately have seen many deaths. The oddest one I can think of is a milk delivery man that was crushed when he was attempting to unload his truck, and a stack of milk crates tipped over and hit him. Also a man that had a ditch full of manure cave in on him. He was badly burned and passed. Story 34. I had a friend who was a CHP that told me about a lady driving her car over a bridge. She was driving with her daughters and felt herself suddenly go very numb. Believing she had just had a stroke, she stopped her car, and her daughters called the police. After CHP and EMT arrived, they stated that she seemed fine and they were going to assist her out of her car and take her to the local hospital to run more tests. As they lifted her out, they pulled her off a pipe that had been lodged through her seat and into her spine, and she passed instantly. Apparently, she had run over a pipe that was laying in the middle of the road, and it ended up lodged into her undercarriage, through her seat and into her spine, with no one knowing until she was out of the car. Story 35. Not my story, but my grandfather used to work on the trains, and sometimes during the night some people would lay on the track and have sex or whatever young people do, and on a few occasions they would be hit by said train. They would have to stop the train and get towels and cover the bodies. Most of the time the bodies couldn't be identified, and they would have to wait for someone to report them missing. Story 36. I worked with the ME in a small town in Canada when I was a resident. While I was there, an older woman who was a hoarder had her house filled to about 5 feet deep with piles of newspapers and magazines. She was found literally drowned in the papers, upside down, wearing only a housecoat, her naked bum in the air and her torso and head buried in the papers. She possibly was looking for a specific item, and the papers caved in, trapping her. It was quite grisly. We couldn't get her to lie on the gurney properly. It was pretty horrifying. Story 37. Medico-legal death investigator from Texas here. Being in a large city, we have a number of deaths that are odd. However, there are a few that definitely stand out. My worst was a scene I worked where parents left young children home alone, and the youngest, 19 months, got placed in the oven with it turned on. I have worked a scene where a man ended her life by lying down on train tracks and passed. On one unfortunate and windy day, we had 2 different men that got crushed by slabs of granite that got blown over only 5 minutes from each other. Story 38. I worked as an autopsy tech intern for a while. Weirdest case we had while I was there was this 500 pounds man who lived in a small trailer home, wasn't answering his phone for about a week. His sister got nervous, so she took a drive over to his place. Noticed a rank smell before even opening the door. She found him face down and blue. Investigators got on scene and they actually had to tear the wall off the trailer home to get his body out because he was so huge, we didn't have a body bag big enough for him, so we had to close it with duct tape. Turns out he had a thing for sex toy all over his trailer home. He had one inside when he was found, probably pass of a heart attack. He was definitely the worst smelling body and biggest I ever encountered. Story 39. Not my story, but my dad was a sheriff, and he used to see so many horrible accidents, but there was one that left him scarred. Boy wandered off from his grandmother's house and ended up falling into a small pond nearby. And fall into pond. When my dad got there, the kid's heart was still beating, and my dad did everything to revive him. The child ended up passing my dad's arms. I remember him coming home and crying. So sad. Story 40. I was an insurance agent. So I got to see all sorts of autopsy reports and death certificates with weird stuff. The weirdest was a hospital report that had a death report at the end which stated, "Cause of death not fully known. Autopsy reveals stomach contents contained approximately 35 cents in nickels." Honestly, the oddest thing I've ever read. Story 41, family of 4, parents, teenage child, tween child, decided to go swimming at 2 a.m. in February in some kind of retention pond while socializing with friends. Alcohol was involved for at least the 3 oldest. They were almost immediately in trouble, but the people they were out there with couldn't find them to save the parents and tween. The older child never came through the ME's office, so I assumed they lived. The weirdest thing was doing the family one after another. Any being able to see how much the youngest child was such a perfect mix of their parents. Story 42. Not a doc and not my story, but a guy in a halfway house for people with mental illness. He loved to chew on plastic and they found him blue in the kitchen. 911 is called. M's auctions. Attempts to ventilate, nothing. They intubate him, and despite visualizing, they get massive resistance. Guy gets transported to the ER that does a surgical crick. Deep suctioning and nothing. On autopsy, they found he had a plastic glove wedged at the carina, with a finger going down each main stem. What are the odds? Story 43. Not any of the professions mentioned, and this is just an odd story I know of. When I was younger, I heard of a situation that caused 3 deaths in a family. Their swimming pool had an electrical malfunction. I think it was the lighting IRC. And the youngest daughter went in and was electrocuted and passed. The mother sees her daughter floating in the pool and jumps in to save her, and she's also electrocuted and passed. Later, the older daughter comes home and sees her mother and sister floating in the pool and jumps in to rescue them and also passed. Finally, the father gets home and realizes something is up and calls authorities and leaves the bodies alone for whatever reason. So they all pass in a follow-the-leader fashion because of a simple, light malfunction. Story 44. I learned about radiation in a past job and heard about cases of death by radiation. The weird part was how long it could take for someone to die. I heard of a scientist dying within 3 days from an extremely high dosage, and a couple of facility, possibly a power plant, workers dying over the course of 3 days, around 200 days. The radiation also had different effect on their skin depending on these doses. The scientists swelled up hugely, but the facility workers looked zombified. Story 45. I worked as a funeral director assistant in Toronto for 3.5 years. Nicer way of calling me body removal. I had a coroner's call involving a chicken. Old man was running a bath with his pet chicken, took a step in the tub, slipped with the chicken cradled in his arms, and went face first into the filled tub, past the chicken and himself. Coroner requested the chicken to be transported with the deceased in the pouch, body bag. Weirdest thing I ever had to remove. Story 46. Mortician here. It's odd, but sad. Not long after Christmas last year, a special needs older man tried changing out of his pajama top. Somehow, he got caught in it and hit himself. Definitely a 3-point embalming. Story 47. Paramedic here. The city was doing construction work on a local street and had put up a bunch of metal sawhorse barricades, the ones with the orange and white reflective stripes and the little orange strobe light on them. Some guy was trying to pull out of his driveway and apparently went to move one of the sawhorses. He slipped and fell against one, and it hit him in the armpit. The wound was less than an inch deep and maybe a half-inch long. Hit an artery, and he passed. Story 48. We had a case once. The dude was a window washer. First day on the job. Somehow the scaffolding got tangled up and slingshot him off an 8-story hospital roof. Splat. The ambulance company charged his family $700 to pick him up outside the hospital and take him into the emergency room. Story 49. Observed a few autopsies a few years back. Not really the weirdest, but one was a young man found passed sitting in front of his computer with his pants down and adult film on the screen. Apparently, that is not as uncommon as one might think. Story 50. In my anatomy class, we had a ton of cadavers to inspect since our medical school was very large. We had one cadaver, and the professor knew the cause of death, so we had to try to figure it out. We first found big lacerations in the esophagus, and then finally a G-fruit-sized ball of blood once we opened up the stomach. Turns out, something the person ate or swallowed tore, hit their throat. Crafty way to die, but cool to investigate. Story 51. I rotated through the Wayne County Medical Examiner this winter, Detroit, and the surrounding areas. A guy had been drinking heavily for a day or two, which scared his live-in girlfriend. She decides to go to her mother's, but figures that leaving their 2 kids with the guy was fine. The eldest daughter, 9, wakes up to a loud bang, investigates, and finds her dad end his life. He looked at her, said, "Did it work?" Daughter calls 911. Then the guy pass. Story 52. Story here from a friend's childhood in NYC. An elevator in a downtown high-rise suffered a catastrophic cable failure, allowing the car and its passengers to fall. Luckily, there were people entering, just exiting the thing when the cables failed, and their bodies formed an abrupt sort of meat wedge in the doorway, preventing its descent. My friend just passed this year at age 84, so it happened some time ago. Story 53. I work as an eye recovery tech for organ donors. Not the strangest thing, but just one of the most crap happens death I've seen was someone who passed on 3 inches of hot dog. It kind of put things into perspective for me in that when it's your time to go, it's your time to go. No matter what you're doing, your last day can be tomorrow doing the most mundane thing. Story 54. I heard a lady one time tell us that her brother was a plumber. He was called onto a job at a house, and while working outside, mentioned the rancid smell coming from underneath the house. The plumber got really sick, and 2 days later passed from a toxic algae. A couple years later, they had some more work on the house and found an algae that was toxic. Sadly, the family was never able to prove that it was that house that hit him. Story 55. My elderly neighbor fell in her shower and couldn't get back up. Don't think the fall hit her, just injured her. Anyways, she lived alone and no one came to check on her for a few weeks. When they opened the door to the house, water came pouring out because it had flooded. It was horrible and smelled so bad. Morgue workers. What is the weirdest cause of death you have been able to diagnose? How did you diagnose it? Story 1. I'm not an examiner, but in the medical field, so I have heard firsthand of some bizarre causes of death. 1. Bee sting to the inside of the lung. A woman accidentally inhaled a bee and it stung her. Apparently she was allergic. Took a week to figure it out. 2. A man with a very weird fetish put a live eel inside of him and it tore a hole through his large intestine. Pass. Story 2. I do not work in the medical field, but about a decade ago, I heard a story on the radio about a guy who was found passed in his hotel room. They determined the cause of death to be asphyxiation. As it turns out, the guy had been biting the calluses off of his feet, chewed off a big piece and passed. I can't imagine what was going through his head while passed. Also, I've always wondered what the conversations were like at his funeral. Story 3. Did an internship at the office of the chief medical examiner. Guy end his life in a river by wearing a backpack of rocks. Was found soon and didn't have much bloating, etc. due to the submersion. Upon examination, he had a lung infection, where his right lung had disintegrated into green liquid. We removed 1.5 liters of green fluid from his chest cavity. His left lung was fine. It was determined after looking at his medical records that he had been to the doctor's office 5 times before he ended his life, and that this infection had been going on for almost a year until it got this bad. Numerous doctors had overlooked it. Accounts from those who knew him suspected that he ended his life to stop the pain. Story 4. Am a friend of a coroner's assistant. He spent a few months there. He said his craziest experience was when a man came in apparently expired. He was a little vague about how the guy ended up on his table with the coroner, but he'll chalk it up to being early in his career. He starts to do a standard Y incision on the torso. He stops early on. He noticed that the guy had slight active vitals. He looked at the mortician present and says, "Oh, duck, this guy's alive." They determined the best way to resuscitate was to do an adrenaline shot. Now, apparently, he was declared dead, but had something akin to pufferfish poisoning induced to his body. Anyway, the guy comes to, screaming like a maniac, and with his chest partially open. He described the whole thing as surreal. Story 5. I'm a criminal defense attorney. Had a client charged with murder for essentially getting into a shoving match with a guy. No external bruising or scratching. No evidence of trauma anywhere. They found a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Turned out he had a ton of booze and dew substances. The substances had constricted the blood vessels and driven the blood pressure up, and the booze had thinned the blood out. When he bumped his head slumping back, that was all it took, and he blew out and was dead in less than a minute. Really sad case. Story 6. Well, not a dead body, but I was a security guard at a hospital in Alaska. One of my duties was to bring deceased folk to the morgue, so I had a key to it. Get a radio call that some patient's wife wants her husband's wedding ring back. I assumed it would be on a deceased person. I go to the morgue to look for it. I look all over, no gold ring. I even open the coolers, no bodies. I then look in the fridge. Turns out, this guy had gotten his hand hit in machinery. I had to get the mangled ring off his mangled hand and clean it off and go give it to him. Story 7. This isn't very uncommon, but what they had to do to save the mother was. I was doing clinical rotations and was told this story by an NP who used to work in India. So, nurse practitioner is helping a doctor deliver a baby in India. Well, when the baby was dropping into birth canal, its shoulder and head got stuck. The doctor stuck his hand up to try and reposition the baby, but it wouldn't reposition. Baby pass in birth canal. They still have to get the child out of the mother. Since the baby can't come out pussily, they opt for a cesarean. Story 8. Former embalmer, funeral director here. It was one of my first full independent embalming, and I had a middle-aged woman come in. First things first, wash the body and remove any piercings, knives, and makeup. This woman had on dark blue eyeshadow and bright red lipstick. As hard as I was scrubbing, the makeup wouldn't come off. I called the senior embalmer in, and he took one look and said that the makeup was tattooed and that that's more common than people know. Story 9 was a police officer and helped with a case where there was a guy in his 50s who died laying on his couch. He had told friends he wasn't feeling well for a couple days and figured it was some cardiac-related event. Nope. Ready for an irrational fear? Guy had undiagnosed hemochromatosis, high iron, that destroyed his liver, his ongoing cirrhosis, and the liver's inability to process blood as fast as it was being pumped, caused varicose veins in the lining of his esophagus. This was a decades-long process. One day, one or more of the esophageal varices hit, and the guy slowly bleeds to death through his digestive system while thinking he had a stomach bug or something, only to die taking a nap. Get regular physicals, folks. Story 10. I'm an apprentice funeral director, but we had an autopsy tech come into my school once to do an autopsy demonstration. He was asked this very question, and this was his answer. Male, mid-50s, presented with jaundice and other signs of alcoholism, but supposedly no history of drinking. During preliminary observation, techs noted a red liquid coming from inside. Assuming blood, it was tested. Came back as red wine and blood. Turns out the deceased was a closet alcoholic who would give himself enemas with whatever alcohol he had. In this case, red wine, story 11. Working the ambulance for a barricaded male. After an hour of standby, trying not to fall asleep, a cop bangs on our window frantically to call us into the house. Guy put a shotgun in his mouth, but must have flinched last minute and hit his face. Only time I ever saw an air nurse shriek at the sight of it. Story 12. I've seen quite a bit. Working at the Okami has been a summer job that morphed into a side job while I'm in school. The top 3 most unusual calls I've been on. 1. A man pass of a heart attack while pleasure himself. The responding officers left the adult film playing on the television just to make it awkward when I arrived. It was a cassette. Dusra. A man was sitting on the railroad tracks at a railroad crossing to end. He's life by train, where is very messy and annoying to have to pick up, mind you. But a drunk driver was trying to catch air over the tracks and hit the guy, but threw his body off of the tracks before the train came a couple of minutes later. Story 13. I worked briefly as a morgue assistant a few years back. The job mainly consisted of moving corpses and holding organs while the pathologist did his thing. By far the most what-the-heck-worthy death I saw was a guy who had been working in a factory, getting himself off by rubbing his junk on the underside of the high-speed conveyor belt he was meant to be operating. He got caught and it lost most of his junk. Ruled as death by misadventure, he had bled out torn femoral artery before the paramedics even made it to the scene. Story 14. Former biological anthropologist. As an undergrad, I worked for a forensic anthropologist. This is the weirdest case she had that I got to see for myself. It was from the 1920s. My boss had inherited a coroner's collection of odd, interesting bone he collected during his tenure in a major city back then. Coroners could just take whatever they wanted from bodies without telling the families. If the individual was poor, indigent, a minority, they really helped themselves, sometimes taking the whole body. This coroner took a lot of stuff, even rearticulating some of the pieces, reconstructing how they looked when they were attached to the rest of the person. So anyway, she has this collection she inherited, and several of the pieces are designated what she calls death by testosterone poisoning. They did not literally die of testosterone poisoning, but they all died because of risky, stupid, ridiculous action. Think Jackass, only with no monetary payout. The weirdest one was from early last century, a man in his 40s who passed from sepsis from multiple arm fractures that he got in an arm wrestling contest. Why multiple fractures? Because even after cracking his humerus, upper arm bone, a bit, he couldn't bear losing, so he just wrapped it up with some kind of splint, had some guy hold the fracture, just a crack at that point, and went for best 2 out of 3, whereupon he snapped the humerus all the way through and broke his radius and ulna. When he slammed his arm down on the edge of the table in anger, the preserved bones came with the whole story recounted in the coroner's notes. Story 15. I'm not a medical professional or a mortician, but I think this story is relevant to the question, so I'll share it anyway. A few weeks ago, I was driving a guy to a hospital 3 hours away. He was a truly amazing man and regaled me with a myriad of fascinating tales of his youth and previous jobs. He got on to explaining his family and how he had 2 nephews, but now only had 1. I asked him what happened. Apparently, his eldest nephew, around 28, was riding his motorbike on a weekend out in the countryside here in the UK. They found him later that day, dead on the side of the road, on a corner, motorbike next to him, with no obvious signs of impact or anything that could possibly have led to his death. It took a long time for them to work out what had happened. Eventually, they found a small bruise about half an inch in width on his temple. After some investigation, they discovered that the corner of road had just been resurfaced and had some loose stones on top. They concluded that as he rounded the corner at about 30 miles per hour. Story 16. I'm a nurse, and this 80-year-old man had fissures inside and was admitted to the ICU because he shoved an entire frozen D-cell-sized mag light up inside. He went to surgery to have it removed and later passed from septic shock. The mag light, however, survived. Story 17. My ex-employer was a funeral director coroner in Nebraska. He told some crazy stories. 1. Found a guy dead in his laundry room. Glass bottle taped to the agitator on the washing machine. Broke when the guy attempted to pleasure himself by sitting on it. 2. End he's life by train. 3rd, lots of horse ducking stories where guys are kicked and found with their pants off in the stables and they pass. 4. Drunk driving farm equipment never ends well. Story 18. Here's a second-hand experience of something my cousin went through a few years ago. It's the ducking weirdest thing I've ever heard, and it's worth a read. So my cousin and his best bud from med school wound up at the same hospital. His friend became a mortician, and my cousin is a proctologist. One morning, my cousin gets a call from a patient he had an appointment with later that day. Patient asks secretary if he could come in early. His issue was getting far worse. When asked what was wrong, he refused to explain and demanded to speak with my cousin. Now, my cousin has terrific bedside manners, the best I have ever seen. He makes it a point to speak with his patients whenever they need to. So he gets on the phone with this guy, and the guy starts pleading with him. So my cousin had an opening and told patient to come in during that time. So patient comes in and is sitting in the exam room. My cousin walks into the room and asks him what's wrong. Patient proceeds to strip fully nude, get on all fours, and stick his ass out at my cousin while on top of the exam table. The guy began to explain how leaking crap and it hurts really bad. Except my cousin apparently immediately saw that it wasn't leaking crap at all. The guy was leaking half of his damn intestines. At this point, I wish I could say my cousin got the guy the help he needed. But before my cousin could do anything, the guy just screamed, "Just yank this goddamn crap out of me, man. Get it out," as he reached behind himself and yanked his damn intestines so hard that he erupted with a fountain of blood, coating the nurse and my cousin. That was apparently the most inhuman scream that Stephen, my cousin, had ever heard that day. The guy was in so much pain that he passed out and fell off of the exam table, hit his head on the corner of a chair, and passed instantly. So cue Stephen's best friend, the mortician. Does an autopsy. Cause of death was pretty straightforward, all things considered. But apparently his friend found an unraveled slinky string throughout patient's digestive tract. Like the guy took a slinky and ate it while straightening the metal out. All in all, makes me shake in anxiety just thinking about the whole thing. Story 19. My dad told us that they once had a guy bleeding out on the table from a wound. Someone had stuck a light bulb up inside, broken it, and hit him when he tried to escape. And he still escaped. They stabilized him, but he passed of septic shock. This was told to us over dinner, mind you. Story 20. I had the pleasure of being a contracted developer to help implement a case management system for a state medical examiner. CODs are an awful thing to read. There are so many ways to become no more. One that still sticks in my mind is the roofer who was breathing fumes from an industrial-sized bucket of glue. He passed out and his face dropped into the glue, was brought to the morgue, still holding the bucket. Story 21. Worked at a funeral home for a few years. First ever house call I took was to pick up a guy who passed at home. Heard from his son that he hadn't been to the doctors in 20 years. We take him to the medical examiner and discover he had a hernia on his junk, causing it to be the size of a football. Not sure how he lived with that thing, but he was wearing jeans and a jockstrap to keep that thing in. His toenails looked like dragon toenails, as he obviously couldn't bend over to clip them. You know it's ducked up when the medical examiner calls another medical examiner on duty to say, "Hey, dude, come check this out." Story 22. My grandfather did some work as a doctor in Indonesia. He told us stories of people who'd had pathogens living in them and eating them from the inside out, some in really grotesque ways. Some people had fungus on them that basically sucked their lives away. So not a coroner, but still kind of interesting and gross. Story 23. The short of it. Man passed from endometrial cancer. Man had a transplant prior. Woman who gave transplant had metastatic cancer that had spread to said organ unknowingly. Man survived transplant, but cancer cells from the transplanted organ populated and he ending up passed from her cancer. Story 24. Weirdest case was a guy who ended his life. Wasn't hard to figure out, but the weird part was that he and his friends were having some sort of death race. Like, who could end life first? We realized this kid, 21 I believe, had overdosed. Alcohol and some other stuff. That was his third attempt that week. We saw that our pedestrian versus train from a week before was one of the friends in this pact. Don't end your life by train. It's really messy, and we gave to walk like a half-mile of tracks to make sure we found all of you. Plus, you're forcing the conductor to lost you. But the thing that made me mad was that this guy knew he was trying to end his life, yet he wore 3 damned pair of pants, and I was in charge of undressing the body. We couldn't cut the clothes off in case the family wanted them or something. Undressing a body that's already in rigor is hard. He had a pair of jeans, then a pair of Superman pajama pants. Underneath those, a pair of Charlie Brown Christmas boxers in February. I swear he did it just to piss off a morgue worker. That happened to be me. Another weird one was a guy who ended his life by slamming into the Jersey wall on the highway. Car stopped, his body stopped, his heart kept going. Then the car burst into flames. So we had a super crispy critter that came in. That was a mess. All because his GF dumped him. Story 25. I run a forensic science summer program for high school students, and we take them on field trips, one of them being a forensic medical center. The me there said that he once had a body. The kicker is, though, that the killer was the boyfriend of the victim. Story 26. Man fell into a septic tank and passed. Found after 3 days. That was one autopsy my staff let me skip, as I started to retch the moment I opened the door to the autopsy suite, despite wearing an airtight mask. Story 27. Well, I'm not any of those, but I always found the death of Gloria Ramirez to be fascinating. Not much as in how she died, but what happened to those around her in that final hour. Staff reported magenta-colored particles in her blood just before nurses started fainting. After the third one passed out, they ended up evacuating the ER, leaving behind just a skeleton crew that tried to stabilize Ramirez, unsuccessfully. Story 28. My mom was a me for years, and she has a handful of interesting stories. As a kid, I grew up on pictures of dead people, and she sometimes would ask me to go over her reports to verify that her point was getting across, because if a 14-year-old can understand it, so can a 40-year-old, right? Anyway, I remember 2 specific instances that brought horror to my young brain and sheer joy to hers. A dude and his life on his wife's panties. A motorcyclist accidentally ramped himself into some woods. What my mom was so excited to show me was his leg, because it was a 1 in a million case. The dude had gone spread eagle and perfectly struck 2 trees on each side of him, basically snapping off his legs. My mom was so excited. Isn't that cool? She exclaimed. I remember vividly. Story 29. Not a medical professional, but was working as a security guard at a major hospital. I saw several disturbing things come into the ER. I got a few stories. I'll share one of the weirder, more interesting. Ambulance rolls in hot. I'm on the dock and open the back door to find big old biker looking dude strapped to the gurney trying hard to come off of it, struggling with the paramedics and hollering, "Let me pass! I want to pass!" Help the paramedics get him back into the ER and begin to hear the story. Biker dude has attempted death with a pen. He hit himself in the chest with a pen, pulled out the pen, and repeated the process over a dozen times. Now I'm thinking, I'd really have to want to pass to hit myself in the chest, but I'd really have to want to pass to pull it out and repeat. Biker dude really wants to pass. He doesn't care how many paramedics, nurses, orderlies, and security guards he has to fight. There were 14 of us who held him down for the docs to work on him. He was restrained, but he was a big old biker and would have come out of the restraints without us holding him down. Turns out, biker dude has hit his heart, and blood is pumping into and filling his chest. We have a young resident who is in the phase of training where he is to make the decisions while the experienced doc looks on. Resident is in a panic and asking the older doc what to do. Older doctor answers all his questions with, "You're the doctor? Is that your decision?" The decision is that the blood must be drained from his chest before it stops his lungs from functioning. All 14 of us hold biker dude down while this is going on. As you probably imagine, bike dude got his wish. He did not live much longer than it took to drill his chest. Story 30. I remember reading this article when I was doing research as an intern for a dental marketing agency about a 24-year-old who died basically from a toothache. He had a wisdom tooth that needed extracting, but didn't have insurance, so he didn't go through with it. Then it got infected and his head swelled up, so he had to go to the emergency room. They gave him prescriptions for antibiotics and pain medication, but he could only afford the latter. So the infection ended up spreading and he passed as a result. I thought it was pretty weird at the time because I had no idea that was possible. Story 31. My dad used to be a cop and had a few horror stories from weird deaths he had to attend. One that I remember clearly was a death. The guy had been fighting with his girlfriend and they had broken up. But 3 days later, she had calmed down and went to his place to try and work things out. She found him passed in his car in the garage where he had gassed himself. By this time, he had been in the car for 3 days, in the heat of summer, and the body had bloated to the point that it basically filled the driver's seat of the car. The other side of the car was hard up against the wall, so to get the car out of the garage and give them room to work. One of the other police officers had to force his arm and upper body past the body to release the handbrake. After they rolled the car out, underneath where the car had been was a huge puddle of bodily fluids that had seeped out over the 3 days. Apparently, all the officers had to burn those uniforms afterwards. Story 32. A welder dropped dead working on a ship. It was determined that working down in the piss-filled bilge, the metal he was welding onto the ship made molten droplets that fell into the liquid around his feet, caused a high enough ammonia concentration to lost him. This was determined by a lab partner of mine who collected her urine for samples several days running and dropped an inch of red-hot Bunsen burner-heated rebar into those urine samples in Erlenmeyer flasks. The welder passed from urine. Story 33. Work as a medical assistant in a hospital. Had a guy come into the ER with maggots hit his legs. He then ate the maggots, mentally unstable, and passed later that night. Not sure what the cause was. Story 34. Nurse here. Had a patient who had not had a bowel movement for 14 days. Tried enemas, Miralax, digital disimpaction, etc. Patient started having extreme anxiety and shortness of breath. Doctors were aware. Hours later, she ended up vomiting her own stool and choked to death on it. She was so full of poop it had nowhere to go but out her mouth. Story 35. My father was a field agent for a medical examiner's office in Texas for about 25 years, and on rare occasion recounted some of the experiences from the job to me. Most cases in the county for which he worked were natural deaths or traffic accidents. His first case, however, was a very unusual homicide. The victim was a postal worker who had been struck by a boy. It turned out that the boy had been lured into the postman's home and was being assaulted when a struggle ensued. The boy grabbed an axe in the home and swung at the postman. Lost him. Freaked out, the boy called 911, reported the body, and my dad showed up. Story 36. I'm a nurse, and I spent the first portion of my career working in an inpatient psychiatric facility. One of my first patients was a woman diagnosed with pica. When I met her, she had already lost 4 of her fingers off and 3 toes. 3, she needed to be almost constantly restrained due to having such a high risk of self-harm. Anyway, one day a family member came and said they wanted to take her home after visiting while she was out of restraints, yet being highly monitored. Against all medical advice, the patient was taken out of the facility and home with her family. She passed due to blood loss a few weeks later. Another is a story a colleague told me. A man came into the ER with a huge eggplant inserted and stuck inside. Funny part was that he said his friend surprised him and shoved it in there as a prank. He ended up needing major surgery and received a colostomy, passive infection a few weeks later. Quite a few awful stories relating to things being shoved up where they shouldn't, actually. Story 37. My friend is a cop. He was asked to do a wellness check on a middle-aged man. The man was seriously obese and had a history of diabetes. My friend knocks on the front door. Nobody. He enters the home, and the dude was on the floor, seemingly pass. Apparently, when you lay near dead for 3 days, blood pools in the lower extremities and they turn dark blue. It's even worse in diabetics. He saw the dude's legs because the dude was naked, covered in his own crap. There was a trail of crap to the bathroom. My friend said the smell made him almost walk out of the house then. He was on the job for about 2 months at this time, and then he realized, oh crap, this is my life now. He called paramedics, but the guy passed at the hospital. They determined that the guy had a stroke on the toilet and tried to get to the front door to alert somebody he was in trouble and collapsed on the way there, leaving a trail of crap across the house that sat there for 3 days until he was found. My friend said that to this day, almost a year later, he still smells the smell of that guy's house. When he went home that night, nothing he could do would make the smell and even the taste go away. He said the second worst part was when the medics got this guy awake again. The man couldn't move or speak, but his eyes were open, darting around the room as 10 strangers were working on him trying to save his life. He had to have known what happened, and he had to have known that this was it. The dude was probably scared crapless, and there was nothing he could do about it now. Story 38. My father has been a forensic pathologist, meaning his specialty is disease, but is also very well versed in all manner of deaths and trauma, especially bullet wounds and knife wounds, for many years. Unfortunately, I am unable to get in contact with him at the moment. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have a field day on this thread. Being the kid of a me is weird. When my dad would pick me up from school, it would not be uncommon for him to be on the phone with an official saying something along the lines of, oh yeah, he hit her in the back with a 12 gauge into the phone. Or when I asked him how his day was, he would say things like, well, I had another obese dude today, so I'm really tired. Story 39. When I was in high school, my teacher told us about some guys from his hometown who got drunk at a gasoline pumping station, where they load up the tankers to take to gas station. They drunkenly decided they wanted to try to swim in one of the tankers of gasoline, so they jump in. They didn't really understand that the density of gas is different than water, making it literally impossible to swim in. They drowned in the tanker. Story 40, paramedic here. Once was called to a notorious gay sauna to find a man slumped forward, kneeling on a bed, dead. No obvious cause of death, nobody else on scene. Coroner found the cause of death to be by internal bleeding caused by rectal trauma. I'm not sure what with, but owing to lack of a nearby implement, I suspect a fist to be the culprit. Story 41. This is a story that was told to me by my college professor, and then, strangely, verified by my father. Back when my professor was a med student, he used to go watch autopsies, as a med student generally does. One day, he walks in on a fat, bearded man from Connecticut, of an approximate age of about 70. He was also very much dead. The cause of death was technically an implication of the heart, but when they started to explore his feet, which were covered in large welts, they found massive deposits of calcium crystals, which had began to form in the legs and feet of the man. Initially, they thought it was a very strange case of the very mundane condition calcium pyrophosphate deposition, until they found a massive collection of calcium crystals, and my professor swears they were crystals in the foot of the man. Now, this would take a lot of calcium. According to my professor, about the equivalent of eating a small pack of Tums a day, or whatever those antacids are called. That Christmas, I was home telling my family about this strange story, when my father, who was a young engineer in Connecticut at about the time the story would have taken place, and he used to work with a bearded 70-year-old man who ate a jar of Tums every day until he passed. Story 42. Worked in the county coroner's office for a while. We got a call, and I got to tag along. The call was for a body in a barn, face down in a 55-gallon drum. When we got to the scene, we pulled him out, and he was bloated and covered in crap, and smelled worse than any other corpse I or the veteran coroner had ever smelled. This was the middle of August, so DECOM had moved along pretty quickly. The cops had found a camcorder on a tripod nearby, and thought this may be some kind of killing. We watched the tape, and it turns out the victim had been crapting and pissing in the drum for quite some time. He would open the lid, lean over the edge, and pleasure himself. Went into cardiac arrest, fell into the drum, and drowned in a vat of liquid crap. Story 43, June 29th, 2007. I'm driving home from a birthday party for my sister up 45 through Houston. It's dark and 2:30 a.m., and there is a body laying horizontally in the right lane of the highway. I pull over to pull this guy off the road to see if he's okay, but as I get out of my car, this guy on a motorcycle, not wearing a helmet, T-bones the guy in the ribs, and does an endo head first into the concrete. Somehow he is freaking Spider-Man and jumps up with just some crazy road rash and broken ribs. We pull his bike off the road and try to get to the guy laying in the road, but too many cars are coming 70 miles per hour down the highway, and we can't. I'm standing 10 feet away from this guy as he gets pummeled by one car after another. When the cops get there, I'm standing there with his blood on my jeans and most like his cell phone in his hands that I found on the road. Evidently, he was crouched in the road when a semi, 18-wheeler, whatever they call it, where you're from, came up on him. The trucker didn't see him until it was too late, and the guy stood up and then was hit. The guy had just got done drinking at a bar and ran out of gas. Decided to walk to the nearest gas station when he dropped his phone or something else onto the road. Bent over to pick it up in a drunken stupor and never saw the truck coming. Story 44. Not me, but my mom. She used to work in the ER. On one particular night, the coroner had her come down to look at one of the bodies. The body was off a woman who had died in a car accident. I guess she was driving way too fast down a very steep part of the highway, and it happened to be raining. At a different hospital, a different nurse was told to give the patient cranberry juice and to irrigate his Foley catheter. She irrigated the Foley with cranberry juice, which hit the patient the next day. On another occasion, when she was working at a different hospital, she had a patient who had a bed sore on the back of her head. The woman was alive the entire time also. Story 45. My cousin is a Chicago EMT and had some stories. Bodybuilder pass in his home when attempting a squat with too much weight. He did what's called red socking. Morbidly obese man pass while pleasure himself. Guy walks into a 711 late at night. When the cashier had her back turned, he laid his junk on the counter. She turned around and in an adrenaline-fueled panic grabbed a can of creamed corn she was stocking and smashed his junk. Completely lost it, and the guy passed. Story 46. What's the worst way to die? Is the next most asked question, to which Melanick usually replies, you don't want to know. When people insist, however, she tells them about Sean Doyle. Around Christmas 2002, bartender Doyle went out drinking with pal Michael Wright and Wright's girlfriend. As they all walked home, Wright thought Doyle was hitting on his girlfriend, and witnesses later told cops they saw a man getting the ST beat out of him. He was heard screaming, "No, don't break my legs!" And another witness said he saw someone throw Doyle down an open manhole. The drop was 18 feet. At the bottom was a pool of boiling water from a broken main. Doyle didn't pass instantly. In fact, as first responders arrived, he was standing below, reaching up and screaming for help. No paramedic or firefighter could climb down to help. It was, a Con Ed supervisor said, 300 degrees in the steam tunnel. 4 hours later, Sean Doyle's body was finally recovered. Its temperature was 125 degrees. The medical examiners thought it was likely way higher, but thermometers don't read any higher than that. When Melinek saw the body on her autopsy table, she writes, she thought he'd been steamed like a lobster. Story 47. When I was in high school, I worked part-time at a funeral home. The county this was in didn't have a morgue yet, so the funeral homes rotating monthly to handle the deaths that would normally go to a morgue. We called it County Month. The weirdest thing I saw was somebody who in his life, by drinking some kind of poison that turned their entire body a bright blue, looked like the forerunner of the Blue Man Group, albeit less lively. Story 48. Not my own story. My father-in-law's, who is now retired, 30 years Lee, retired as a homicide detective. He has many stories, but he got a call to go check on a motor vehicle accident with a single car off the side of the road in a ditch. He arrives to find the passenger outside the car in shock and generally freaking out. He handles this individual and proceeds to the vehicle. He can see the car had run up against a very long stretch of chain-link fence, as if it had been pressed up against it at a high rate of speed for about a quarter mile. The driver of the car was goofing around with his buddy, the freaking out passenger, and stuck his whole upper half out of the car to sit on the windowsill while driving, Being stupid, we've all been there. But he lost control of the car at about 70 miles per hour and swerved into the fence, pinning him between the chain link and the weight of the car. My father-in-law calls this the Great Accident. Story 49. I'm an RN, but IIRC Dan Savage mentioned how a guy kept coming into the ER for UTIs. Now, unless you are regularly being catheterized, men shouldn't be getting UTIs as often. So the guy finally told them that he would self-catheterize and fill his bladder with wine and would offer his services as a wine decanter at a bar. Story 50. Cop here. We attend deaths at home. A guy had passed of an overdose, and with it being the middle of winter, he had the heating on. He collapsed in front of his gas heater with his Jack Russell dog in the flat. He'd been there about 3 months. Story 51. I worked in a clinical research that needed to have adjudicated causes of death, e.g., a nurse who reviews medical records and provides an external professional opinion about how a death plausibly happened, so that we could determine if it was related to the randomized drug they received or not. One medical record read, cause of death, found dead upon arrival, showing signs of death. Story 52. Back in med school, during internship at the coroner's, I saw a case when a man in his late 50s was found dead at home, although under quite peculiar circumstances. His body was found standing, yes, standing key in the bedroom, with one leg raised and resting on the bed, basically as if he wanted to climb on the bed but suddenly died. Further examination led to a severe heart attack as the most likely cause of death. However, no evidence of someone moving the body post-mortem could be found. The conclusion was that either someone would have to have found him quite early and basically hold the corpse for hours until it became stiff enough to stand on its own, or that his death was so sudden that it happened just in the right moment so that his body would be perfectly balanced and not fall over. Story 53. X-ray tech here. Heard from a fellow employee. X-ray tech did a chest X-ray on a male in the ICU with severe pneumonia. He was barely able to get a breath. On an X-ray, his lungs were completely white. White means dense, hard material, like bone or metal. Lungs are a mixture of black, air, and gray. Tissue, mucus. The X-ray tech is puzzled by the complete whiteness, wondering what kind of material it is or what happened to his lungs. So he called the doc for a medical history. The doc replied thusly, patient was on a bender looking for substances. He broke into his neighbor's garage and found a batch of powder in his neighbor's fishing tackle box and snorted the whole thing. A few days later, he developed pneumonia. It turns out that the fisherman neighbor's sister had passed years ago, and the fisherman kept her ashes in his tackle box, so she went with him whenever he went fishing, just like when she was alive. He passed a week later. Story 54. We had a guy come through our trauma ICU who was severely septic, respiratory failure, and was beyond help. The man had apparently tried to chug a large glass of soda and had 2 ice cubes that lodged together in his throat that caused massive epiglottis and esophageal trauma as he choked them down. The man waited several days to go to the hospital and had been eating who knows what in the meantime. His infection got worse and worse, and eventually a family member called an ambulance when he began to lose consciousness. Needless to say, it was a very difficult intubation, and the guy didn't last very long afterwards. Story 55. This is a case I saw several months ago. Two mid-20s brothers had spent a night drinking downtown. They had decided to drive home, 25-minute drive. Late that night, while on the highway, the brothers got in an argument. The driver had gotten mad and bit into the shoulder of the other brother. Not quite to the Walking Dead extent, but pretty damn close. The driver then stopped the car on the middle of the highway, and the brothers began to fight. Keep in mind that it's pitch black outside. An officer happened to be driving on the interstate at the time and unknowingly ran over something. The officer stopped to see what he had hit and saw the body of the driver. He proceeds to then look up and see the stumbling drunk brother get hit by a semi. Story 56. I work in the financial industry handling estates specifically, so I look at a lot of death certificates and obituaries as a routine part of the job. Handled a case where the decedent end his life. That was pretty ducking metal. Story 57. I coordinate anatomical donation and read the death, discharge summary charts for over 20 people a day, and the weirdest ones I can think of are the deaths of totally healthy people, doing totally normal things in life who just ducking die. Undetected heart defects, massive hemorrhages, aneurysms, etc. Weird, scary crap. Story 58. I may have something new to add here. Worked in a mental health hospital a year or two ago that dealt with seriously death patients. Had a guy come in claiming major death ideation, but otherwise pleasant. He asks to be allowed to shower, and staff says sure. Eyesight checks have to be done every 15 minutes without fail. Staff goes to check on the patient and finds him on the floor of the shower, turning cyanotic. The emergency code is called, but nothing worked, and the guy passed right there on the floor. What this guy had done was to turn on the shower, force the better part of a roll of toilet paper down his throat, and stand under the water with his mouth wide open. Once the toilet paper was soaked, it was nearly impossible to expel by using the Heimlich maneuver or whatever it's called now. It's also nearly impossible to clear the airway. He had sucked much of into his lungs. It just shows that there is always a way to hit yourself if you're determined enough. Story 59. When I was a paramedic, we got toned out for a medical aid call. When we arrived at the residence, we found the front door wide open, and my partner rushed straight in without bothering to announce his presence. He returned rather quickly, looking a bit green, and said, "Call the police! She's been murdered!" After calming him down a little bit, he said the place, and that she was face down in a pool of it. I radioed dispatch and requested that a police officer respond to our location. It must have been a slow day. We ended up with a couple of state police, along with the local police department. I went in, leaving my slightly shell-shocked partner outside. It looked like a slaughterhouse. The patient was definitely deceased and was still clutching her medical alert device. The coroner's office finally showed up and removed the body for an autopsy. Story 60. Vet technician here where I worked. We got a lot of bad cases because we worked with the sheriffs and county, so we got all hoarders, neglect, etc. We had a chicken with maggots crawling all over its back end. Literally, it was just constant movement. To be euthanized. While someone was holding her on the treatment table, waiting for a doctor to become available for euthanasia, her entire back end exploded. Clear fluid and maggots about 8 feet sprayed out. Her bladder and a giant cyst sac fell out of her and she passed. I never thought I would see the day where I was able to say, I had a chicken explode on me today at work. Story 61. Pre-med student here, studying forensic science. I had a case study my first year about a man trying to illegally immigrate through a freight of bananas. He was found in the middle of a bunch of boxes of bananas, hitting butyric fermentation. His right leg was more swollen than anywhere else. This poor guy got bit by a spider in one of the banana boxes and was unable to get out to seek help. That's just unfortunate. Technically, he still made it to America. Story 62. Firefighter paramedic here. Probably one of my saddest strange calls was about 6 to 7 years ago now. A little boy and his friend were playing, trying to dig a tunnel through an approximately 5 feet tall sand pile the family had in the backyard due to some construction. They were redoing their whole house. First boy went back home, next door. Second boy kept playing, attempted to crawl through the tunnel they had dug, and it collapsed on him. 15 minutes went by before he was found by mom. We performed CPR, struggled with ventilation because his airway was saturated with sand, but were able to get a pulse back. He passed 2 days later in the hospital. Story 63. EMT here. Still think my reply is relevant. A medic that I work with went with his partner to a call for leg pain, got there, and realized that this man's legs were completely necrotized from the shin down. They wrapped his legs in blankets and took him to the hospital where he died hours later. The man, and also his brother who lived with him, seemed to have no concern that his legs were rotting away up until this point. Story 64. In the book Working Stiff, Judy Melinek describes a case in which two friends have a disagreement. One hits the other, causing him to fall into an open manhole. The hole, unfortunately, has a burst hot water pipe. No brain injuries. So he would have been conscious for most of this. Story 65. I'm an RN in the aged care field. We had a resident who was at the end of her life with ovarian cancer. She had ascites, buildup of fluid in the peritoneal cavity, causing the abdomen to swell. She passed when somehow her peritoneal cavity and then her stomach or something else ruptured, causing all of the light brown colored, odorless fluid to gush out of her mouth and nose. And there was a lot of it. She had been lying there talking and then said she felt off, and not long afterwards it happened. I like to think that she wasn't conscious when it happened because her face was very blank and her eyes vague throughout the process. But man, that wouldn't be a nice way to go. Story 66. Not anyone in the medical field, but I asked a medic the craziest story he ever had to work with. He got a call reporting of a dead body, and he went to go investigate. When he got there, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. There were two people sitting on lawn chairs, one person having a beer, and the person next to him sleeping, with three people around. He thought they were called out of a prank of some sorts, and asked where the dead body was, and it turned out the person looking asleep in the chair passed for 3 days. One of the three onlookers was having a mental breakdown and saying, "Oh, he is just cold," and putting a blanket on him. Story 67. I used to be a hazardous waste porter for a large hospital. I was the only one, in fact. This led to many calls to take care of some nasty thing, and even resulted in a friendship with the director of the morgue. Well, one day he went to pick up a body in the backwoods hillbilly part of the area. So he goes to the address and is told the body's in the barn. He opens the door to the barn and is immediately hit with an intense and heavy smell. He looked around to see piss, crap, and vomit everywhere. The hick had been ducking and had a heart attack in the process. Story 68. I was taking crime scene photography last year, and toward the end of the semester, our professor showed us some closed case photos. There was this man who bloated in the heat and was practically completely black from rot and other disgusting things growing on his corpse. A few days passed after he had died in his small home. No AC in the Louisiana heat. When the paramedics and CSIs showed up on the scene, the stench alone made the new guys throw up all over his lawn. Cause of death was determined to be that he chalked on some chicken he was eating. Hospital morgue. What is the dumbest yet most impressive cause of death you ever came across? Story 1. My grandfather passed when he decided to go and lie down because he wasn't feeling very well. My grandmother asked, "Should I come with you?" To which he responded, "Go back and eat your food. I'm not having a heart attack." He was having a heart attack. Story 2. One of the most common causes of death at the Grand Canyon is the male instinct to urinate from high places. Men camping in the canyon go to pee off the edge of a ledge in the middle of the night, fall off, and die. Story 3. Local naturopathic doctor took some Chinese herb to cleanse herself or some BS. Put herself in kidney failure. Husband finally calls 911 after she goes unconscious. At the hospital, we're able to get her dialysis and bring her back around. Tell her with the right treatment, we may be able to restore some kidney function. But if unable to, that she could continue on routine dialysis and hopefully get a kidney transplant. Her response is that she doesn't believe in modern medicine and that it's poison. She left the hospital aiming to go home and treat herself with her own medicine. Her treatment didn't last long. The problem solved itself. Story 4. Just to add, Judy Melinek in her book, Working Stiff, written about being an NYC coroner, talks about a man who was in a fight and got thrown down a manhole. Problem was, a steam line had burst in the tunnel, and he started screaming in pain the minute he fell. By the time EMTs got there, super dead. Story 5. About a dozen, give or take, people pass each year in Yellowstone due to death by buffalo. When I was there in 2006, I had to stop Japanese tourists from taking a picture with a buffalo. Story 6. My wife was an A&E nurse outside Tokyo. Best story I heard was a guy stuck a vibrating toothbrush up inside and passed out on substances. The toothbrush buzzed away until it hit his colon. Passive sepsis. Story 7. My great-grandfather didn't want both of his testicles removed due to testicular cancer. So he said to his doctor, "Leave one in so my wife has still something to play." He passed soon after because of this. Story 8. Don't work at hospital morgue, but dealt with a lot of successions and reviewed death certificates. The ones that stick in my head are pass in Hurricane Katrina. A ride attendant fell in front of a kid's roller coaster and was high to death. A guy who was pleasuring himself with a vase caused a vasovagal reaction and his heart stopped. He was like 25. A guy was assaulted and had major head injury. He survived but had to have a track tube. He went home in a wheelchair and his family fed him fried chicken, and he hit on a chicken bone and his brain was starved for oxygen. He was in a coma for a while and passed a few months later. They then went back and charged the guy who assaulted him with murder. Story 9. My dad used to be the guy who picked up the bodies and took them to the Morgue funeral home. His most impressive was this guy who got his steering hit through his chest. Guy was actually still alive when my dad got to the scene. He was called by a doctor who happened to be stuck in the traffic caused by said wreck and came to render final aid. It was pure shock that was keeping the guy alive, and the fact that the steering column was holding everything in place. The doctor ended up pulling the guy off of the car, which passed rather instantly. He hates talking about that story. Story 10. Two guys in a factory got trapped in a cupboard, decided to pass the time by having a food fight with cocoa powder. They pretty much hit to death on chocolate. Story 11. Don't work in a hospital, but I'm a cop, so I have seen lots of deaths. Let me start by saying that I'm not telling this story to promote or endorse death. A few years ago, we had a guy jump from one of our parking garages. That happens every now and then. What made it remarkable was how he did it. Witnesses say that he parked his car on the top level, got out, and immediately sprinted toward the edge. When he got there, he dove over the wall without ever breaking stride. Most jumpers take a while to do it, but this guy was either dedicated or he knew that he wouldn't do it if he went too slow. Story 12, best one I've heard. Some guy got admitted to the ER for overdose, was given medics, woke up, acted like an a-hole, and left. 2 hours later, he was admitted again, but in several pieces. He tried to jaywalk and got hit by 5 cars, which literally lost him. Story 13, not a hospital or morgue worker, but what about the guy who played Gaston at Disney who passed from lighting a firework on his head? Absolute tragedy. They said it was a mistake. But story 14. Usually men don't go to the doctor when things are wrong. But this guy, he got an ear infection, went to the doctor, got a prescription for antibiotics, and then went hunting and decided not to take the antibiotics. Infection spread to his brain, and he was in our ICU for a while. He very nearly passed several times during his lengthy stay as a result. So I hope it's okay to include this story, but I think he actually survived. Story 15. Okay, obligatory, not a hospital or morgue worker, was not even a witness, but do have some relevant tales. In Spouse's hometown, I think 2 or 3 decades ago, was a death so absurd it is still talked about. Railway crossing on a highway was poorly paved, super bumpy to drive over. Town worker was transporting a manhole cover in the back of a pickup truck. Didn't tie it down because that crap's too heavy to blow away, right? But by some fluke, the way he hit those rails at 110 kilometers per hour and the resulting bounce of the truck, the manhole cover flew up in the air with tremendous force. It had enough momentum to smash through the side of the school bus passing the opposite direction, giving a guy a fatal injury. So always tie down your load. Since I'm at it, I can give you some told to me on industrial construction gigs. Though thank goodness I never witnessed a work fatality, personally. Story 16. I work in a funeral home. We had a guy, high out of his mind, walk into an addiction treatment center in the middle of the night and kicked in a solid metal door. When the cops showed up and tased him, his heart was beating so fast, it stopped. Story 17. I worked in a funeral home for a while. It wasn't exactly an impressive death, in the sense it would qualify for a Darwin Award or anything. But there was one guy who was pissed drunk after partying in the city. His friend stopped on the side of a major highway for him to puke, and he got hit by a taxi. We received his body, and he had a perfect impression of a Ford logo, along with part of the grill from the taxi that hit him on his upper thigh. Never will forget that. Story 18. I don't work in a morgue or hospital, but my brother works in a morgue. He told me this story of a man who passed after trying to swallow a watermelon whole. The man got it a quarter of a way before choking. Story 19. German backpacker in Australia was doing some work on a farm to make some money. He accidentally stepped on a crop harvester blade, and as he was reaching to free his foot, he hit his hand. He left the wounds untreated, worked in muddy conditions, swamps, swam in livestock ponds, etc. He had both hands removed and his foot. The infection tracked to his lungs, and he ultimately passed. He had no mates in Australia. Not one person ever visited him. It would have been less stupid if he had been shredded up by the crop harvester, especially considering the farm he worked on had a medical and a veterinary clinic only a few minutes away. Story 20. My boss was a former cop who responded to a stiff, dead body. It caused a suction effect, and they had to break the toilet to remove him. Guy was in a very expensive suit, too. Story 21. I don't know if he ended up dying, but a few years ago, I was a volunteer at the Belgian Red Cross. I just turned 17 when this incident happened. So the 21st of July is a big day for the Red Cross. National Holy Day, a lot of injuries when you have thousands of people cramped in the sun, all watching the parade. A kebab seller forgot that his arms were full of, well, snack oil and fat, I guess. The git then wanted to light up a cigarette. Story 22. We had a patient who was mentally ill and refused her standing dialysis treatment, saying that orange juice and bananas would clean her out. She was told that her refusal would result in her death. She continued to hold to her delusions right up until her massive heart attack, one floor above the dialysis unit. People who work in morgues or with the dead, what is the creepiest thing you've witnessed? Sometimes when people have died, and we turn them over to clean and dress them, they still have air in their lungs and will make grunting noises when moved. Scared the crap out of me the first time I experienced it. Story 2. One of his saddest stories involved picking up a girl whose boyfriend had murdered her. The mother asked the coroner to see her one last time. He told her, "Ma'am, you don't want to do that." She asked if she could at least go on and hold her hand. She was going to come in the next morning and do so before they cremated her. My dad and his partner, who actually was a big burly guy, stayed late that night, washing the blood off her hands and painting her nails so that her mother could have one last peaceful moment with her child. My dad was a hard man and not always the best person, but he did a lot of good in the world too. Anyway, thanks for letting me ramble. Peace, Dad. Story 3. I worked at a funeral home for quite a while. When I first started about a month in, I was working a holiday weekend. Only people working were the transport guys and me. They came to drop off a body and went right back out. I thought they were still there and needed to ask a question. I walked into the embalming area, and this dude was sitting up on the gurney, looking right at me when I opened the door, and it literally made me pee a little in fright. Turns out, the transport guys picked up the body from an area hospital. He'd passed away while in a slightly reclining position, and rigor had set in. They couldn't flatten him out. Still the scariest moment in my career, even if I got a laugh out of it later. Commenter. One of the decedent's grandsons faked a breakdown over the casket. He stole all her jewelry. Didn't take long to figure out, and a large brawl broke out. Jewelry was retrieved. 2 weeks later, grandson turns up, needing to be processed and buried. Creepy as hell. Story 4. I initiated compressions on my patient when she unexpectedly coded. About halfway through my first round, the patient pinked up, eyes opened, turned her head and groaned. I stopped, and so did she. Turned gray and unresponsive, so I started compressions again. She woke up again, and I realized that compressions were providing adequate perfusion to her brain, so she'd wake up, but her heart wasn't doing anything. I had to continue compressions and shock my patient who was awake, groaning, and alert enough to know what was happening. I've coded countless patients without a problem, but this event gave me nightmares for some time. Story 5. I was part of search and rescue for 3 years. I was in the scuba team, so we were responsible for finding the usually dead people at sea. The saltwater adds so much horror to a body, not to mention the fish that usually will start picking on a corpse sooner than later. My creepiest experience was trying to find the body of a Jane Doe was missing. She was an escort against her will, brought over by human trafficking. Turns out she jumped into this rocky and sharp outcrop into the sea. We went diving in less than ideal conditions. It was low visibility and waves. My scuba buddy and I were looking at an outcrop when suddenly out of the darkest, a deep blue hand emerged from this little cavern in the rocks. It began twitching and moving, and as we tried to pull the hand, the rest of the corpse emerged. She was being picked on by Murray eels, hence the twitching. Her mouth was wide open in a scream position and her eyes were gone. Story 6. Human osteologist here. I work with dry human bones, so they don't do too much. But one of the one times I've ever gotten the creeps was when I was handling a cranium in the collection and could hear the wisdom teeth shaking around, partially formed but not quite erupted in the mandible. My wisdom teeth form around 18 years old and erupt generally early 20s. I, at the time, was about 20, and my wisdom teeth were just coming through. I realized these remains belonged to a girl about my age. That's probably exactly what my skull looks like. It really humanized things for me. Story 7. Here's a funny story from my grandma. She used to work in an ER in Puerto Rico. Some guy had passed away, and so the doctor came up to her and asked her to prepare the body to go to the morgue. So she got some sheets and started to wrap this guy up. As she crossed his legs, suddenly his pen became fully erect and was straight up. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but it forced her to have to redo the sheets. So as she uncrossed his legs, the pen went down. So she was like, all right, let's get this over with. Then she crossed them again, and lo and behold, the pen went straight back up. Tried one more time, and then she got freaked out and went back to the doctor. Obviously, he found this hilarious, as the guy apparently had a prosthetic in his pen. Story 8. People who had been on blood thinner medication before they died can make for an odd scene. Saw a guy that had died looking out of his window, so he was discovered with his head on the windowsill, and there was a thick column of jellied blood from his nose to the floor. It was a bit freaky. Story 9. Worked at a mortuary for a few years. We have methods to keep the jaw shut for viewing. Otherwise, it would gap open due to the angle of the head and neck. During a viewing, the device failed, and this gentleman's mouth literally popped open. The lead embalmer was not on site, so I did my best. Ushered the family out of the room and superglued his mouth shut, but he didn't have teeth, and supergluing just his lips did not work. It looked as if he was attempting to scream. Story 10. Not necessarily the creepiest thing, but the funeral home I worked for liked to embalm as soon as possible. After death, I had embalmed a man that was dead for less than 30 minutes, an hour. He was still warm and a rigor had not set in yet. I kind of just held his hand for a minute before I got started. Commenter. When my wife passed away suddenly, I was sitting with her in the ER, and when I came back in, they had her swaddled. I managed to get her hand out and was holding her hand thinking tat. As long as I was holding it, it wouldn't get cold. Story 11. My wife is a mortician. She's had quite a lot of wacky experiences. This is more funny than creepy. But once she was trying to break up the rigor mortis in a dissident's hip by flexing the entire leg up. Her grip slipped and the leg swung down, the heel cracking her right in the face, resulting in a black eye. She had to explain to people that she's not in an abusive relationship. She just got kicked in the face by a dead guy. Story 12. A friend told me this story ages ago, and I hope I remember it well enough. When he was 18, he worked for a single-plane transport contractor, and one time they had to carry a body. It wasn't autopsied or prepared for funeral yet. That was where they were taking it. So it was wrapped and just sort of laying on the floor. Now, when you're in the air, I'm sure other pilots will tell you, the rise and fall of the airplane will do strange things with gravity, air pressure, and necromancy. In any case, the corpse had enough air in its lungs that the lower pressure outside the body caused the air inside to be expelled slowly and through the larynx. Meanwhile, rise and fall of the plane caused the body to sit up and the wrapping to fall away. Sitting up caused it to expel more air from the lung. So while flying a dead body in the plane, they heard a long, low moan and saw a dead body sit up in the back of the plane. The pilot panicked, left the controls, and ran back and punched the corpse across the face, knocking it back down. He told me about how they figured out what happened, but I was laughing too hard at that point to really pick up the details. I do remember that they had to explain the additional damage to the corpse when they arrived at their destination. Story 13. Had a gig doing overnight transport of dead bodies. Think black suit, white shirt, black tie, unmarked black van, and boss made us wear white gloves. He wanted us to look high-end. Needed to transport a recently deceased middle-aged woman 250 miles in the dead of night from a hospital morgue to a mortuary near her extended family. It's been a solid 2 hours of total silence. When the corpse lets out a low wail, sounds like, I about crap myself as I swerve off the freeway and spray out a rooster tail of gravel and dirt. Even though intellectually I know this is just stomach gases escaping the body, I couldn't help but be a little freaked out. Story 14. Attended a suspected fire once, where we could smell smoke but couldn't locate the fire. Eventually located it, and when we entered the house, there was an old woman slumped over on the floor. Tried to turn her over but couldn't. It turned out that she had been laid on one of the old bar-type heaters, and because the heat was not allowed to escape, it had burnt a hole through the floorboards, and the heater fell through the hole. However, when she was laid on it, her body fat started to melt and run into the floorboards. Then, when the heater fell through, she cooled. By the time we got there, she was one with the floor. 2 of us to get shovels under her to roll her over. It was years before I could eat smoky bacon flavor crisps again. Story 15. If someone's been down for more than a day or two, they'll start decomposing from the inside out. If the room is quiet enough, you can hear lots of gurgling and rumbling as the gases and fluids are moving around inside, and then you move them and they groan as the residual air in their lungs is forced out past their vocal cords. Story 16. Before pandemic, I worked at a funeral home that wasn't particularly well run. I was a funeral assistant, and one of the embalmers was notoriously difficult to deal with. Her name was AJ. About 4 days before this story, AJ had picked up a deceased man who had died and who was to be cremated due to the fact he was already in a bad state on death. So AJ had the brilliant idea to leave this gentleman on the rolling cot for 4 days unrefrigerated, figuring it wouldn't matter since he was being cremated and it was a slow week. Of course, I got the job of moving him to the crematory with AJ. We walked into the embalming room and found that the decedent had bloated and was leaking a gray liquid sludge out of his urinary catheter onto the floor. If pestilence had a smell, it would have been this liquid. It smelled like a warning to the base lizard part of my brain. To describe this liquid as smelling bad is an understatement. The liquid was something you could feel and sense in the air. AJ and I donned our gear, and luckily since she placed him on a cot already, we didn't have to do much in the ways of moving the body. Unluckily, the cot was relatively old, and one of the cot wheels had to be manually unlocked using hands, as the foot pedal was too rusted to effectively use. AJ told me to unlock it, and so I carefully bent down and unlocked the wheel. Well, Age got the bright idea to shake the cot violently as some sort of prank, sending the gray liquid over the edge, directly onto the top of my head, dripping down under my eye protection and mask. I closed my lips and eyes so the liquid running over them would stay out of my body, and calmly walked to the employee bathroom in a sort of numb state of shock. The funeral home owners saw my sludgy appearance and sent me home paid for the rest of the day. Story 17. I delivered pizza to a crematorium. The dude set down his pizza on a cardboard coffin to get money, and I couldn't stop looking at the box on the conveyor leading into the crematorium chamber. I pointed out, "Isn't that a little disrespectful?" The dude came back and simply said, "Oh, don't worry about him, he won't mind." Story 18. In 2010, there was a large Taliban offensive. This usually entailed small arms fire and rocket attacks. No big deal. In general, the Taliban would not attack a large foe for obvious reasons, and instead rely on indirect attacks like rockets or mortars. Sometimes, however, there would be an organized attack using dyed bombers. After one of these attacks, I was sent out with a small team to patrol and assess the fence where an attack had just happened. I try not to think about this too much, but when I rolled up, there were body parts everywhere, from where the dyed bombers tried to get through the fence and detonated themselves. Body parts everywhere were bad enough, but what really ducked me up was seeing a guy perfectly degloved face caught in the chain link fence. Imagine a realistic human face mask, including hair and mustache, hanging in a fence. It was exactly that, except with a real face. Story 19. I got punched in the balls by a dead guy. I used to work hospital security. Part of our job was to help with 10 to 80 assists, movement of bodies to and out of the morgue. I was on a call to move one, and the body's limbs were sticking out at odd, stiff angles. I attempted to move the corpse's arms into a better spot to shimmy the bag into the body fridge. His arm stayed in place for a moment, but when I released my grip, smack! Old buddy hit me right in the sack. Story 20. My best friend growing up lived in the upstairs of his family-owned funeral home. We used to play hide-and-go-seek in the caskets, until one day one of the empty caskets wasn't empty because they had just gotten a delivery from a different funeral home. Story 21. I work with a lot of hospice patients, so death is a common occurrence in my field. One night when one of my patients had literally just passed, the phone rang. It was the daughter hundreds of miles away who had never checked in on mom the whole time she was in my care. She sounded panicked and asked if mom was okay. That timing always weirded me out because it really seemed like she somehow knew something happened with her mom, who near the end was confused and constantly insisted she needed to find that daughter. Story 22. Here we go. Back in the day, I used to work for a funeral home, and oftentimes when an elderly client has prearrangements and they pass away, I would be dispatched to collect their earthly remains and bring them back to the funeral home to be prepped for their celebration of life, going away party. This is after there is no suspected foul play. Now, sometimes this would be a collection directly from the morgue or from their residence. More often than not, this was typically in the middle of the night, on call 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Well, one night I was dispatched to collect an elderly gentleman who crossed the Rainbow Bridge and was deemed to be picked up around 1 a.m. By the time I got ready into the residence, it was around 2 a.m., and I went back to the funeral home around 3 a.m. Once I helped Mr. Doe get comfortable in our cooler, I was ready to leave. As I was just getting ready to set the alarm and head back home, the prep room door behind me flung open and then slammed very abruptly. This door is very big, very heavy, and takes some power to open and close. Needless to say, I was early for my normal shift in the morning because, well, I didn't go back to sleep. The creepiest thing about it is that just before that happened, the hair rose on the back of my neck. Story 23. My creepiest moment was when I was in the morgue by myself at 4 a.m. I was using the lift to put a body into a crypt. It had reached roughly eye level when the power went out. It is now pitch dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Then all the fans died, and all I could hear was the crinkling of body bags. That's when I started to hear disembodied voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying or where they were coming from. The power comes back a few moments later on, and I move on with my night. Turns out, the voices were just the automated, "The power has gone out," switching to generator power message. Haha. Story 24. I am an ER nurse. One time, we had someone die and no one came to claim the body. So they went to the morgue and that was it. But their phone stayed behind in the ER by accident every day at 2:30 p.m. An alarm would go off. We couldn't turn the alarm off or shut the phone off without a passcode, and the battery on that thing was lasting forever. So we locked it in the med room, but it was still really loud. We had to listen to that dead person's alarm haunt us at the same time every day for a week. To this day, I shudder when I hear the same ringtone. Story 25. Not the answer you're looking for, but I worked as a gravedigger cemetery worker throughout college. The only weird thing I experienced was an unexpected pothole over a section of graves. If a casket is buried without a cement vault, eventually the casket can collapse, and it creates a pothole over top of the grave. It's a pain in the ass to deal with from a groundkeeping perspective, and it's a little weird to think of the casket collapsing 6 feet below ground. For that reason, the cemetery where I worked required burials to have a cement vault. It was the older caskets that didn't always have them. Honestly, I'm not a fan of over-dramatizing places like morgues and cemeteries. Death is a natural part of life. The cemetery I worked out was one of the most peaceful places I visited. We worked hard to make it comfortable and peaceful so that loved ones could feel peace and comfort when they came to visit. Story 26. EMT in a past life. We get a call for someone who has no pulse, not breathing. The first on scene is a cop, and my partner and I arrive shortly after. The guy's in his bathroom. That happens very frequently. Deceased, but still recently enough that we should make attempts to save him. It's a little tight in the room, but we manage to place a backboard on the floor and just need to get him onto it to start compression. I take the guy's airway and head. My partner takes the guy's chest and shoulders, and the cop gets his legs. We lift him to the backboard, and it turns out he has a prosthetic foot. Our officers already felt over their heads on med calls. So when this cop was left with a foot in his hand and nothing else, he literally ran out of the room. Not creepy to my partner and myself. We could add diabetes to a likely med history, but the officer, man. Story 27. My first job was at a cemetery. We had a common burial, someone who cannot afford a casket or vault. They are provided with a wood frame and cardboard casket. We dug the hole the night before. It rained heavily that night. The next day after the ceremony, we lowered the casket into the water-filled hole. It just floated on top. So we used a backhoe bucket to push it down. The casket fell apart and the body slid out and floated. We pushed her down and filled the hole. I protested but was told this is how things were done. I still feel bad about it.